Oh, to have a crisp white new Acorn Electron. Look at that. And look at mine. A delicious combination of yellowed plastics, sticky fingers, and 30-year-old gravy. There's only one thing for it. It's Mrs. Retro Man Cave's toothbrush and a hell of a lot of elbow grease. So let's get stuck in, cave dwellers, and right this very retro wrong. So let's start with these grimy keys, and for the keyboard aficionados out there, these are Futaba or Futaba, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, ML switches, the same as are used in an Atari 800 XL, and it's an incredibly satisfying keyboard to use, quite surprising considering the cheap price point of this computer. So the keycaps just pop off, but it wasn't long before my fingers started aching from prying the keys off, so I fashioned a tool from a pen lid in the hope that I could easily pull the keys off without causing damage or scratching any part of the computer, and it worked beautifully. So let's pry all of those keys off. The spacebar is an exception as there's a metal bar underneath it which hooks into the key. The safest way to remove it is to push the spacebar to one side and unhook it, although as you can see this part which it hooks into does actually pull out, so you could pull the spacebar off, but I'd be careful with old brittle plastics in case you snap that part and just gently unhook it. Thankfully I only have to touch these keys one more time in this condition, and that's to put them in this bowl of soapy water and give them a good scrub. Let's leave them to soak to one side while we take a look at the rest of the keyboard. I should really send this type of thing off to a lab one day to find out exactly what it contains. Now the keyboard PCB is on the back of this piece of metal and it's joined with this kind of rivet here. I couldn't see a way of undoing that without causing any damage, although it doesn't look too bad behind there, so I think what I'll do is spray some compressed air to clean out behind it, and we'll give the top here a good brush down to remove all of that debris and fluff, as well as a wipe down with some isopropyl alcohol. And then it's back to scrubbing our keycaps. You'll notice, for example, on this key how it's yellowed on the top compared to the bottom. The classic old computer yellowing that we see on every computer that comes into the cave really, with the exception of the ZX Spectrum and those black coloured computers. Now there's nothing technical about this process, it's just an arduous task of scrubbing, scrubbing and more scrubbing until we've worked through every single key. And once we've done that, we give them a rinse off with some clean water. Set them to dry and leave them overnight. And lo and behold, the next day they're lovely, clean and dry and ready for retrobriting. We can then move on to the case plastics, and once again it's a task of fingertip cleaning, working slowly around every single centimetre of the case with the toothbrush and getting into those textured plastics full of ground-in chocolate bars, dirt and who knows what else from the last 30 to 35 years. I will of course not complain about the dirt on this machine because it was very generously donated to the cave and I know our kind donor is watching this video. So it's a small sacrifice to do a bit of scrubbing in the name of reviving this small piece of computer history. Speaking of which, if you haven't found it already, you should check out the Centre for Computing History on YouTube. It's a very special museum on the side of the famous Bletchley Park in the UK, home of the Enigma code-breaking efforts, and on their channel they have a lot of very interesting interviews, including one with the designer of the ULA in this machine, Steve Ferber. One of my favourite accounts from Steve is how he reminisced about his love of early flight simulators, and he truly considered his first computer to be a success when he saw a flight simulator running on it. A common theme among computer designers. For example, Jay Miner, the father of the Amiga, said exactly the same and included features in his machine with flight simulators in mind. Anyhow, let's get back to the cleaning. So after all that, and with a final rinse, our computer is now spotless, if still yellow. A lot more could be said for Mrs. Retro Man Cave's toothbrush, but we'll just slip that back in the bathroom and hope she doesn't notice. Up next is some retrobrighting then, and as it's the British winter time, there's very little sun. In fact, it's raining outside at the moment. So I'm attempting this very crude method of retrobrighting by lining a box with tin foil and putting our peroxide coated plastics in there with a UV light above it. Hopefully the combination of UV light and warmth in that box will cause our plastics to turn white again. This is the method I used to finish off our Amiga 500 restoration, but never to retrobright fully from start to finish. And it worked, but boy was it slow. I think I probably need 3 times the UV light to get anywhere near to the speed of the natural light method. But fear not, because then... the sun has come out to play, and I take a rare trip outside of the cave to soak up some sunshine and take in the view from my back garden. And what a lovely view it is too. This part of the world is known as the Cotswolds, and I'm really rather lucky to be able to live here. So let's abandon the UV light idea and get all of the plastics out here while the sun's shining. For the keycaps, I've put them in sandwich bags and mixed them with the peroxide and some warm water, just to make sure we get a good soaking and coverage of that peroxide over every one of the keys. And then I've aligned them so they're all face up and they can bathe in the sunshine. Everything seemed to be retrobrighting swimmingly, with the exception of those keys. They were turning whiter, but very slowly, probably because I diluted the peroxide with the additional water. So to finish them off, I put them on a baking tray and put the peroxide cream directly on them and popped them back out in the sun for another hour. Retrobrighting complete, everything then got a good wipe down, and we start to see the effect the retrobrighting has had on the plastics. I'm quite pleased with the result. Now someone may be able to correct me, but I don't think the Electron was completely white when it came out. I think it was slightly cream, and that's the finish we've got. If you have a better memory than me and can remember the original colour and think we need to go up a shade, then by all means let me know, and we can always pop it back out in the sun again. Either way, it's certainly an improvement over how it was before, and now we can rinse down the keys and go through the arduous task of popping them all back onto the keyboard one by one. Growing up in the 80s, most of my friends had computers. I was the only one with an Amstrad CPC 464. The majority of others had Spectrums, and there was one friend whose brother happened to have an Acorn Electron. And there was really only one reason that we snuck into his room to play on it when he was out, and that was Elite. Even though the game was available on my friend's ZX Spectrum, piloting across the vastness of space, with a decent keyboard that clunked and clicked, just felt more realistic than the spongy keys of the Spectrum, I guess. So all I'm doing with the keys here is rinsing off any peroxide residue before I handle them without gloves. And if we take a closer look, remember I showed you them before and there was like a gradient of yellowing towards the top? Well, now the colour is consistent all the way across the key and looks much more like an original key. I'm pleased with how they've come up. And after all that, we have a refurbished Acorn Electron keyboard ready to go. So let's turn our eye to the system and power boards. As I mentioned when we looked at the board in part 2, I'd like to recap the system to make sure it's good for another 30 to 35 years. Now, on closer inspection of the power board, there's actually some very high quality capacitors on here. There's a 3300 microfarad 35 volt Rubicon capacitor here, and Rubicon is a good brand. There's also these Nichicon, sorry if I haven't pronounced that properly, capacitors, which are also known to be a good brand. The power board also has the advantage of being separate from the system board, so any leaks should be contained unless they're neglected for so long that they work their way down the wires, and under my ownership of course that won't happen. So the power board I'm not going to mess around with, but the system board I am going to recap, and I'll show you why. The capacitors I'd like to replace are these 5 axial capacitors, which are Ritchie branded. Now this is a lesser known brand, at least it is to me anyway, and they seem to be the original capacitors. A less well known brand capacitor of 30 to 35 years old, located on the system board, for me is a candidate for replacement. The capacitors I have are from RS Technologies here in the UK, and they're not a particularly premium brand, they're this brand Vishay, who as far as I know don't have a bad reputation, and of course a present day average brand capacitor is surely better than a 33-year-old average brand capacitor, so I'll go ahead and get those swapped out. We'll cut through the footage here as I change them, because one thing I find particularly difficult to film is soldering. I always seem to get my hands in front of the camera at the vital point, so I decided to focus on the soldering and just show you what I could, and then we'll look at the finished result. The Electron, in comparison to some other machines I've worked on recently, was an absolute pleasure to recap. Nearly all of the capacitors popped off with the minimum of fuss and just a touch of the soldering iron to heat them. Much nicer than a recent ZX Spectrum I recapped, which was really stubborn to work with. So everything's swapped out nicely. The only one I wasn't quite 100% happy with was this one. This is a 33 microfarad 25 volt capacitor. The replacement I purchased had a slightly higher voltage, which is fine, but it came in a slightly larger package. So I just had to be careful that it fit into the space it had and didn't touch on the RF modulator shielding next to it. Nevertheless, I was happy with the result, and most importantly, the board was still working afterwards, and if you're going to attempt this yourself, it's worth knowing that unless you have the keyboard plugged in, the machine will fail to turn on. So if, like me, you like to test the board after changing each capacitor to make troubleshooting easier, just remember you have to plug the keyboard in every time, or you may wrongly think that the machine's not working. I obviously learnt the hard way, so that you don't have to. The boards get a good soaking and clean down with isopropyl alcohol now, and longer term viewers will notice I've actually splashed out on some anti-static brushes, a rare treat to myself thanks to donations from my patrons. In our previous video I mentioned that I performed the LK4 mod. That's to convert the composite out from black and white to colour, but working with this machine I'm actually quite happy with the output from the RF modulator. To me it looks just fine on my television. So maybe we'll come back to that mod at a later date. And we've got an awful lot to squeeze into this video today, so I hadn't forgotten about it. We're just going to skip that one for today. But now at last we can get everything back into the case, we can give the power board a quick clean down and screw everything back together so I can showcase and demonstrate not only the final product but also a few add-ons for you as well. With our keyboard reconstructed and reunited with the bottom half of the case, we can now reflect on some before and after pictures. Before, there was gravy, and after, a beautiful clean Acorn Electron. No more biology experiments on my keyboard, just crisp, clean, restored keycaps. This Electron really has found its former glory, so let's power her up and take her for a ride. A topic of hot debate in a previous episode was me suggesting I'd replace the power supply. Well, I went ahead and ordered one, and yes, I'm an idiot, I ordered one with the wrong connector. So we'll continue to use the original for now, and I'm sure that debate will continue to rage on in the comments section. A familiar sound as we power it on to any old Electron owner, and thankfully there's a life on our screen and everything seems to be operating correctly. I'm sorry Electron, you'll have to find some new gravy, and it won't be coming from me. This machine originally arrived as a donation along with a stack of games, and if you watched our October donations video, you would have seen I picked out one game in particular called Rick the Roadie, and it looked so ridiculous I have to try it, so what better place to start than with Rick the Roadie in our cassette player. You didn't really think I was going to play on an LCD, did you? I have of course paired it up with a CRT TV, and what's my verdict on Rick the Roadie? Absolutely terrible. The goal apparently is to drive to a gig before unloading all of the equipment, but I never made it past stage 1, which is the driving stage. A cross between Spy Hunter and the driving stages of the Ghostbusters game. I really wouldn't bother if I was you. A better game I found among the cassettes was Percy the Penguin, which played like a cross between Dig Dug and Repton, and I had a lot of fun with that one. It even had some music which Rick the Roadie didn't, strange considering that was a game about a band. Playing these games, our Electron hasn't missed a beat, but how can we improve the experience? Well, the first way I can show you thanks to a very generous donation by cave dweller Chris Mills. Chris watched our previous episode and sent me this. It's an Acorn Plus One. The Plus One is an expansion module that slots into the back of the Electron. It gives us an analog joystick port suitable for 2 analog joysticks or 4 paddles, a printer port, and 2 general purpose slots. One of those general purposes is to slot ROM cartridges in, mitigating the load times of cassette tapes and giving you instant play. I received one ROM cartridge with this, and it's this, the Tree of Knowledge. On the face of it, a question and answer guessing game, this educational title sneakily teaches you about databases, and would no doubt have been intriguing to school children at the time, and who knows what schoolboy facts they might have snuck into their database to surprise the next user. You'll have noticed there as soon as I turned the computer on, it booted straight into the ROM cartridge, and the expansion adds a significant size to the machine, a third extra in length, meaning I had to move the TV screen in order to fit it on my desk. The Plus One then is a great expansion which will remain a permanent fixture on my Electron, but how about something a bit more modern? How about an update for the Electron that's available new today? Well, thanks to another donation, this time from John Kortink over in Holland, I can show you a very special add-on which is available today, and I'll include links in the video description. What we have here is an Elk to Go SDC as well as a Cart to Go SDC. Those are the green boards, and the blue board is a Go SDC. And what is it? Well, it's a floppy drive emulator that reads whatever data's on the SD card, giving you quick and easy access to whatever huge library of games that you want to put on that SD card. The two green backplanes are to allow me to plug it directly into the back of the machine, as I'm doing here, or I can swap the blue Go SDC unit over onto the other card, and that will slot into the Plus one. And here's how it works. With a simple command, we can see a list of everything that's on the SD card. We can mount our chosen image. And by holding down Shift and Break, the machine will reset and then load whatever we've got mounted. Loading times are 0, and for me this is the icing on the cake of this Electron. I'll swap this over so I can mount it in my Plus one, and I think maybe source an analog joystick to complete the set. So thank you again to Chris and to John for your very generous donations. They've found a good home here where they'll get good use, and it's great to be able to demonstrate it to everyone else on our channel. And so with a game of thrust and then repped on, we come to the close of our episode for today. A longer than normal episode because I really wanted to show off those extra add-ons for you and not skip too much over the process of the restoration. I'm really pleased with the result and ecstatic with the new ways in which I can use this machine with my add-ons. As mentioned earlier, I'll include all links in the description so you can go and read about those yourselves. The SD card reader is something that John does as a hobby, and no doubt he'll be happy to answer any questions that you have on the topic. So let's take one last look at our restored Acorn Electron, surrounded by its extras, and we couldn't bring the video to a close of course without showing one last game. It's Elite, the game I used to play all those years ago, and a game whose legacy lives on today in the form of Elite Dangerous. Thanks for watching, especially to Martin who donated the machine originally. If you enjoy my content, why not subscribe to my channel, and if you really enjoy it, why not pop over to my Patreon page to leave a tip or to become a patron and help to support future videos in the longer term. Thanks for watching, Cave Dwellers. Take care.